We'll kick off with Sean. Why do most principals whom I know are not in favour of or wish to control parent associations?
I'd say, well, first of all, the question refers to most principals I know. I mean, I have no facts and figures on this. I have no sort of sense of whether we're talking about 5% or 55% or 95%. But I did allude ago to the fact that we're in a changing sort of phase from a time, let's say, when I say virtually every principal teacher would have been uneasy about the idea of a parent association. I think I'd like to think that that's changing more quickly now because of the obvious, let's say, interactions between the Principals Network and NPC. I'd like to think that there's very few. Well, in fact, I know that all principals have received communications from us encouraging them to set up parent associations where they don't have one, and encouraging them to actually make sure that those associations affiliate with NPC, because an association without that affiliation is more, well, I would say would be more difficult for themselves to manage. I mean, being part of a network nationally can only benefit them. I think, I mean, we have, in our publications and in our conferences, we have publicly and systematically, spoken about the asset that parents bring to a school. And I mean, and I think, like, there's also a huge shifting demographic as well, because in the last 5 years, I think about 65 to 70% of all principals have been either left the job or retired or resigned. So there's a huge turnover in school leadership at the moment, and I think I'd like to think that the younger principals maybe might have more openness towards seeing parents as an asset and a strength in the school, rather than maybe something to be worried about.
And our next question now, thank you, Sean. Our next question now is for John. Why is crime more common in poorer areas, and how can we break this cycle?
Obviously, God, that's a very complicated question. For many reasons. I suppose the first reason is lack of education. We know that early school leaving is at its worst in the more socially disadvantaged areas, where huge numbers of parents have left school. In some cases, in parts of Limerick City, up to 70% had left school before the junior cert, and huge numbers way before the junior cert. Many never went to secondary school, and it's the same in Dublin and Cork. And so it starts off, I mean, that's one. The second thing would be the culture. The culture in socially deprived and disadvantaged areas would be one of negativity, destruction, human destruction, the environment that maybe our housing policy created, many ghettos. Des O'Malley, a number of years ago, when he was getting an honorary doctorate degree in Limerick University, on reflection that night, he said that the housing policy in Limerick City over 30 years was a disaster, and that was a man who had been in central government for years. So many factors. Then you have nowadays in the last 20 years in particular, of course, you have another layer, and that's drugs and drug addiction and all the violence that's associated with that, and the power and the control and all that sort of stuff. And then you have the stigmatization of people, something that we haven't ever really taken on board, and that is that people come from certain areas, they're stigmatized, their address is certainly a major disadvantage, and in terms of opportunity in life, it is an inhibiting factor. And then, of course, the old hardy annual as well, financial resources would be a huge issue. Being able to resource and facilitate the development of the child to become a positive person in society rather than maybe a negative person. So there are lots of things that contribute to the fact. And how do you break it? You know, the way that has been done is the way to do it, if they'd only resource it to do it. But of course, we come up with great ideas, and then we just you know, stop resourcing and facilitating the process. Small classes, more you know, a greater you know, involvement of parents. Again, in a school, I was in Limerick, I was fascinated last week in the fact that many of the parents are also going to the same school to do different elements of adult education. That is a fantastic way of doing it, bringing the parents into the classroom, into the same school as their children, going to school some days with their own children. And that's obviously something that is going to create a different environment, a different attitude to education. And I suppose the final stage of it would be payback. Would children going to and finishing, for instance, second level education, would they be able to go on to third level? Would they get employment as a result of finishing second level and all that? Some individuals do, and when they do, they become very positive role models in that particular community. The problem is that most of the role models in those communities are negative role models. They are more likely to be criminals and car stealers and drug barons than they are some positive professional role model. And the task is to try to change that, to demonstrate that education at all its levels is absolutely crucial in changing the way of life of people. But it's a massive uphill battle, and I'm afraid with cutbacks and with the economic situation as it is, it becomes a bigger struggle, because naturally cutbacks, I've often said it, you know, a euro or two off of people at the bottom is the equivalent of hundreds of euros off of people at the top, and people often don't get that. So it's a difficult, and I suppose change, then the final thing would be facilitating the change of people in terms of change of culture, and that's something that can't be enforced. It can only be nurtured and supported and encouraged. But at the end of the day, it's the people themselves who have to agree to change and go about that journey of change. And I'm afraid that's also a low, frustrating process, and bringing about the sort of change. And it won't be done in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. It'll take at least one generation and perhaps 2 or 3 generations before you see the payoff.
Thank you, John. And this is for Sean now. How can schools use technology and social media to engage with parents?
And I suppose certainly, I mean, most schools now have moved towards developing a website as a means of providing information about the school, let's say things like the school policies, procedures, calendars, successes, celebrations, information about extracurricular activities and so on and so forth. I think social media, which probably goes beyond the concept of websites, is as of yet largely, I suppose, untested or unguaranteed in terms of its suitability. I mean, there are lots of questions about, let's say, Facebook and the whole concept of you know, the data and the images and the content being owned by, let's say, the actual Facebook empire, as opposed to by the people who put it up there. I think schools are treading very cautiously in that area. I know of a few schools that have Facebook pages for the purposes of updating parents on things, but the trouble is that a school has to communicate to all parents, and not, I say, there may be some communities, but I would hesitate to guess that most communities would have at least some few percent who wouldn't actually have access to technology. I mean, there is still a divide there, and so some say it's growing, what I call the digital divide between those who have technology and those who haven't. I mean, there may be dozens of schools, there may be a few hundred schools in the country that have every parent with access to the internet, to Facebook, to whatever. But there are certainly hundreds, if not thousands of schools where, as I said, there'll be some cohort of the school not actually having such access. So then the rest of the thing is, do you actually do you add to the divide if you use the technology which you know that not everybody has? One of the, again, it's not a social media per se in terms of my understanding of what social media means, but one of the facilities, let's say, which schools are now using is a thing called text to parent. You may be aware of it, for the purposes of it's one-way communication, but it's largely for the purpose of let's say announcements or change of plans or sometimes also in encouraging messages with regard to maybe some success that the school has had. But again, and reverting back, let's say, to Facebook, you've all seen us in the last month or so there are quite an amount of reports about bullying taking place online. It's an area, I suppose you said, that I'd like to know in 5 years' time how we'll be looking back on how we actually dealt with it, because in some respects, the National Centre for Technology and Education, which provides the standards and so on and so forth for schools, they ban certain websites. They only, well, sorry, it's actually they only approve certain websites for schools, and Facebook is not accessible in the school, so for obvious reasons. But then that denies the teacher the capacity to teach children about the dangers of something like this. You know what I mean? So there's a kind of a bit of a quandary there. Is it better to get involved as educationalists in helping children to understand better the risks? I mean, all the surveys show that there are still high percentages of 10 to 12, 15-year-olds giving information over the internet about themselves which they shouldn't be giving. The strictness of our own access guidelines means we can't use the internet to actually show and teach the children about these dangers. So there's an element of chicken and egg, but I think it's obviously a trend which isn't going away. It's a question of how best do we use it, and I think we'll learn from our experiences, and some of them will be unfortunately bad experiences. But hopefully within the next few years there'll be more regulation, and I think the internet law apparently is quite a new field as well, and it's very hard to pin down, let's say, things like culpability or responsibility for whether it's statements of fact or fiction about people. So until such time as there's more experience of incidents, one way or another, and how the legal system treats it, and how the educational system also treats it within the context of school. Until then, I think most people are being very cautious about it.
Okay. Thanks very much, Sean. Now, next question is for John. What can parents do, or teachers do, or maybe we can ask it in maybe two parts, in terms of what can parents do and maybe then what can teachers do, to keep more young men out of Mountjoy?
What can parents do? Very, very difficult to say that men or women, mainly men, who end up in prison are there because in any way of an inadequacy around the parenting support they got, or the ability of the parents or the attitude of the parents. I'm afraid culture certainly is an element, and that means that the parents are, inheriting their parenting skills and their culture from their parents, and in some cases that means that a generation after generation of people end up in prison. It's all around culture and conditioning and an acceptance of criminality and all those sort of things. So I guess myself that education is a very important element of it. The more, I believe, the more that the human being is educated, and it's in a broad term of education, the more that they're aware of the different elements of parenting and the things. At the same time, I would have met lots and lots and lots of people in prison where they themselves would say quite openly, my parents did their best. I knew several families of 5 or 6 children where one child ended up in prison on a regular basis, and the other 5 or 6 were perfect. in terms of holding down jobs with third level education, a whole lot of things. And you'd have to say, where did the black sheep come from? And then is it emotional, psychological, psychiatric? Is it a combination of others? Is it a behaviour disorder, a learning difficulty? There are numerous reasons why somebody might. Could be bad influence, it could be a teenage years. There's a whole lot of factors that would bring a person to prison. In terms of teachers, I guess the difference between the feedback I'm getting anyway in relation to primary education and secondary education, a lot of it is around the relationship that exists between the teacher who is in the primary school and the relationship with their children. And one of the things that lots of the children were saying to me last week was, because we have the same teacher throughout the whole year, so we get to know the teacher very well, and the teacher gets to know us. And these are only 12 and 13-year-olds, but they're already able to articulate. And those who left primary and didn't make it in secondary, quite many of them, a fairly consistent pattern was around they found the transition so traumatic and so difficult. The 7 and 8 and 9 teachers they found very, very difficult. The attitude they found quite different as well. The great focus on academic achievement and on all that, and getting through the curriculum and all that. And they fully understood, by the way, the dynamics of it, that the teacher had to try to get the 25 young people through each stage of it, and that one or two fellas that were difficult or finding the pace too fast for them, whatever, they just hadn't the time to give the attention to the individual students. So the lack of flexibility, and I'm afraid the relationship thing would be very important as well. And on the other hand, some young people would say that one teacher that they met in their lives made the difference between them dropping out or not dropping out. So as I said about parents, teachers as well have the potential and the opportunity to do very wonderful things, or also to do very destructive things. A lot of it is about attitude, how you see the young people, and what interest you take in them. And some of the stuff that young people are saying, why they left secondary education, it is very interesting. And it is a challenge for second level education to how can you marry the two. The sort of flexibility that you need, the level of attention that you need to give some children to try to help them not fall behind, and at the same time meet the main thrust of the demand on teachers, which is to get through the vast numbers of pupils right through to the Leaving Cert, where points are so important. So it's a very complex, difficult task, and so I would say education for parents, support for parents. Lots of parents in socially disadvantaged areas struggle as parents. An amazing statistic in Limerick City was that in the two big socially disadvantaged areas, 45% of the parents were lone parents. Now that's a phenomenal figure. Almost half of all the parents in both big north and south, huge socially disadvantaged areas, 45% are lone parents. So that's another challenge. How do you support lone parents, in terms of financial support, in terms of all the sorts of things that we're talking about? So it's a complex, challenging issue, but it is an issue that is there for the Minister for Education and for government generally to challenge, because at the moment there's a significant number of young people falling out of the education system before junior cert level. And about 50% in most places that start secondary school are gone by junior cert. And even in the best schools, about 50% go through to Leaving Cert. But that means 50% have dropped out as well. So while the 50% who finish off and do the leaving is fantastic, but equally we should be concerned about the 50% that have dropped out.
Thanks very much now, John. For Sean now, back to Sean. Some children in my school are having difficulties with maths, especially those who come from other countries where maths are taught differently. Is there any structure in place within or outside the school curriculum to help these children? And I suppose too it would apply broadly anyway, I suppose, in terms of maths, that we know that some children have problems with maths. So
yeah, I think I mentioned earlier this morning, or earlier this afternoon, about the literacy strategy and the numeracy strategy, but very little is being said as to what the numeracy strategy is, because maths in primary school always plays second fiddle to literacy, because obviously literacy is the entry point to everything, but you can't live your life without mathematics either. in everything we do, every action you take, whether it's driving a car or whether it is coming in here to pick a seat or going shopping, most of our lives, you're constantly managing numbers, percentages, distance, time, so on and so forth. We live in a mathematical environment, but we don't necessarily see that. Unfortunately, the cutbacks in education, as they have cut out most of the what they call the EAL teachers, the English as an additional language teachers, who were there specifically to work with kids from overseas who hadn't mastered the language of the school and as in the English language. Some of those EAL teachers, I remember I had 2 of them at one stage in a school down in Cork, where we had 30 kids from overseas, but they were only able to deal with the language needs. They didn't have the time or the capacity to deal with the mathematical needs. And to my knowledge, there are no structures that I'm aware of outside of, let's say, the mainstream school system where these kids unfortunately wind up failing and also have an impact, especially on the challenge levels within the classroom, because it is very, very difficult to put it, if you child in let's say second class, and there are maybe 3 or 4 kids who are maybe at a level 2 or 3 years behind that child. It's not just a multi-grade classroom, then it becomes multi-grade with other additional needs as well. I think, well, one of the initiatives that said that our network, that's the Irish Primary Principals Network, one of the things we're planning to do over the next 4 or 5 years, it's part of a long-term thing really, and it'll be depending on us being able to get private funding for it, is to look at areas such as that, where there is a gaping hole in the system, and not to replace the work of the Department of Education, but to look at areas that the Department of Education has never actually dealt with themselves because either the lack of funds or the lack of vision or whatever, and try and provide programs or services for such children through their parents. I know, are you familiar with a thing called the Incredible Years Programme? The Incredible Years Programme it's a whole new approach to behaviour management in schools, and the feedback on it is absolutely fantastic. And in particular, say, in schools where traditionally there would have been disciplinary issues, principals and teachers and parents are reporting that there's been a phenomenal, where the programme is put in place, where the teachers and the parents are trained up on it, there's a phenomenal change in the actual culture of the school in terms of respect and so on and so forth. I think those schools are being funded privately, I think, from some external source to actually, because this is a program which there's a cost in implementing it. I think if we were to look at a similar program to the mathematical deficit that you're talking about, I think it would have similar results. But the trouble is that it's hugely labour intensive, it's costly, and I think it's certainly worthy. But to answer your question bluntly, I think I'm not aware of any particular means at the moment by which that issue can be dealt with.
Okay. Okay. So we've got 5 minutes more questions. Just to the question that John was asked previously was about what parents or teachers can do to keep more young men out of Mountjoy. Now go on to kind of almost a third part of that and to ask, what can the wider community do to keep more young men out of Mountjoy?
Well, I think what the wider community can do is I suppose goes back to fundamental policy around, I would say, the single biggest factor that we have developed over the last 30, 40, 50 years since we took over responsibility ourselves and since we have control over our development would be our housing policy, especially our public housing policy. I'd say that has been the biggest single contributory factor. For instance, in Dublin, I should also mention, I suppose, that the total lack of research that's available to people, to the general public or to politicians or to anybody who wants to try to find out and to understand what's happening. There's a huge vacuum in terms of research, and so we don't know a lot of the answers to a lot of the questions. But in 1997 was the last piece of decent research that was done in looking at the population in Mountjoy, and now that's 15 years ago. So I'm sure things have changed dramatically in 15 years, but still going back to that time, 6 small little areas in 6 separate postal districts in Dublin supplied 75% of all Dublin-born prisoners. So you had 6 tiny little areas within, associated with 6 separate postal districts, and 75% of all Dublin-born prisoners came from those 6 little areas. And they were all the most socially disadvantaged areas with high levels of unemployment, high levels of addiction, high levels of dysfunctionality, everything. So, and I'm sure it's the same all over the country, and I'd say in Dublin it has got worse instead of better. So I think in terms of the wider community, I think a lot of it is around to more integrated communities. I think the destigmatisation of areas, greater resources in terms of amenities as well. We build houses in Ireland. We're an amazing country. Like we feel, I suppose this comes, I don't know where it comes from, but we feel that, you know, there's a house for you now and away you go. It's like giving a homeless person an apartment and saying, no, that's it, go off now, you have a home. And of course they haven't. They have a bed and that's it. And unless you provide support and all other sorts of infrastructure. It's like our revolution in the psychiatric services, which the revolution was fantastic because it closed down huge numbers of mental hospitals that shouldn't have been in the first place. But what it didn't do, of course, the whole thing, it didn't put the resources back out into communities to support communities to cope with the new challenges and to support people that have difficulty in relation to mental health. They can live in the community provided they had support. They can't live in the community on their own. So we have huge issues around making the point, and I've often spoken about this because I live, as I said, out in Kilmacud in Dublin, and I have often spoken about the resources and the amenities that are there. They're second to none. You name it, it's there. Universities, shopping centres, facilities, housing, tennis courts, swimming pool, you name it, every amenity, several choices of secondary schools, all sorts of things, but every amenity you could think of. And the people out there would say, there's not enough, our children need more. And they'll get more because they know how to get it and they know where to go to look for it. And you compare that then with the area that I'm talking about in the 6 areas where all the prisoners come from. And I've been in all 6 places. There's nothing, only misfortune. And you say, how the hell can a child grow up in this area to be able to compete on an even playing pitch with the guys out in Kilmacud? And the answer is, to be honest, they haven't a hope in hell. There's no way they can compete. You know, I call it, you know, that the child in one area, in the affluent area, if they haven't the talent is forced into them. And the child in the disadvantaged area has all the talent in the world, but the sin is he or she doesn't even know they have the talent. And will never be discovered, and will never be developed. So I suppose that's the conflict that you're in. We have a social class status society, whether we like it or not. It's there for everyone to see. And I'm afraid the roots of a lot of the criminality, not all, by the way, because there's always exceptions now, and you know, and this is not an excuse for anybody to commit crime, but it's just, I suppose, it's trying to understand the contributory factors and the causes and the things that the oxygen that feeds and supports criminality. You know, the gangland feuds, for instance, they're not in middle class or affluent areas. Their gangland feuds are in the most socially disadvantaged areas. And I've often said, well, why don't people ask that question? Why the hell are they out in there and why are they in Kilmacud? Because there's a completely different social structure. So it is a very complicated issue as well. It's around, I suppose, sharing resources. It's around greater equality and greater opportunity and all that sort of stuff. And instead of, especially with the Celtic Tiger, instead of things improving during the Celtic Tiger, I think it's fair to say that the gap widened, actually. And that, you know, so many children went on the road of private education and fee-paying education and all that, where instead of having any contact at all with a social mix of people, they actually segregated them more and more. And I'm afraid that's some of the real challenge in these areas. The amenities, we don't put in the amenities, but we expect the young people to grow up motivated and all that sort of stuff. And even with Ireland, in this week, anyone again that will be driving through Dublin, if you are driving through Dublin, you will notice that where are the strongest indications of the identity around Ireland? In the more socially disadvantaged areas. Isn't that amazing? If you go into the most socially disadvantaged area, even a stone's throw from here, the whole place will be full with colours and all the... And that's a sign of people crying out for identity, crying out for something to celebrate, crying out for something to feel good about. And I think it's a great indicator of the vacuums that are there and the need that people have to feel good about something.
Okay, now we're drawing to a close on questions. What I'm going to try and do is one more question. and a slight multi-parter maybe kind of for Sean here. You've written recently on the desirability of principals moving to new positions every 6 or 7 years. This is what's been said. So the question then is, do you think that it's a barrier to increasing parental involvement is posed by principals for life, being set in their ways then and resisting change? So the questioner has said that you've written recently.
Yes.
I don't know if you have or not, Sean.
Yes.
You have. And I suppose the questioner is concerned that how much of a barrier to increasing parental involvement is the fact of principals for life.
Thank you. I'm clear on the question now, yeah. Yes, I mean, it is the policy of our network that we believe that a 7-year term, a 7-year contract for principalship would be a good idea, because I think research shows that not just in schools but in most organisations, leadership is obviously critical towards almost every aspect of the success of an organisation. But a leader has only so much to give of him or herself, and that after 5, 6, 7 years, there's, a person has given what they're likely to give to an organisation at that stage, and the rotation of leadership is good for the organisation. It's good for the staff within it. It gives more sense of opportunity for let's say for promotion. But also it would mean that would require the putting in place a structure for principals who want to step down from leadership. But at the moment there's none. So at the moment, if a principal wants to step down, effectively they're out of a job, because there is no panel. There's no you can't redeploy principals. So the first part really is, yes, I'm confirming that is the case, and why. The second part of it is I think, I suppose we all get set in our ways, and the older we get, probably the more set we become. I suppose it's a huge leap for a principal teacher, let's say, who traditionally got away with, let's say, keeping parents at the gate of the school, to suddenly involve them in something like shared reading. Whereas, there's such a huge number of young teachers in schools, like as in kind of from 20 years of age to 30 years of age. In the last decade, because of the huge numbers of kids coming into our system, and also because of the amount of resources being put into special needs, there was a huge inflow of new teachers and many of them are superb teachers, but with open minds, and I think possibly more open to these kind of ideas as well. Can I just add one final comment? It refers to John's last question about what can people do to keep people out of jail. I was part of a programme in Cork a number of years ago. It was a leadership programme where we went on site visits to various organisations. We spent a day in Cork prison, seeing how it worked, looking at it from the inside out. And I think it was the starkest experience of my life ever, actually spending 14 hours inside in Cork prison as a guest of the governor, not the nation. I think if schools, if second level schools could build in, and if it could be, I don't know how feasible, John, it would be that in transition year that kids would get a chance to see what prison is like, because the television has made prison look good. Prison is not good. Prison is rough and it's raw, and I think to be a nice injection of reality for kids that's been, when it comes to, for example, like, the child who's, let's say, smoking dope and who's sees an opportunity maybe to start selling it as well. I mean, if they realise the consequences at that age, it might have some positive effect.
Okay. Thank you to both Sean and John for the answers to the questions there. Thank you.